Jonathan's footsteps echoed off the grey cobblestones, filling him with a sense of dread that he had never known. Not a single soul could be seen. They were all gone. In a panic, Jonathan ran from street to street, searching for someone, anyone, but all he found was nothing. The once busy streets were deserted. Cars sat eerily empty. Jonathan pressed his hands against the tinted glass. It was cold under the edge of his palms. Inside the metal coffin of the car, resting lazily on a seat, was a pink, stuffed bunny. Its ears were worn and tattered, and the stuffing was leaking out of its body, almost like it had been in a violent fight for its own life. Its sad eyes stared back at Jonathan. It was begging him to find its lost owner. The day had faded into night, and purple, green, blue, and red neon lights cascaded into the lonely street. They could no longer lure the unsuspecting person to buy their unwanted stories. Mannequins stood in the store windows, dressed in the finest clothes. One in a gold and silver dress. The bright sequins reflected the light, reminding Jonathan of a magician trying to hypnotize some drunken lout into thinking he was a duck or some other kind of animal. After all, wasn't that the purpose of such clothes? Jonathan thought, with a sense of melancholy beginning to surround him like a fine mist that clung to him like a constant companion. Staring at the fake woman, Jonathan took a moment to remind himself what another human looked like. Her hard plastic exterior was rough, and her face didn't quite look right. But it was the closest thing he had to another human being. Jonathan didn't allow his mind to drift, but he lost himself in the moment. Within a few seconds, he was transported back to another time that seemed like a lifetime ago. He was having his last conversation with another person. As his memories came flooding back, it was clear to him that it was just like that day. All the sounds, sights, and smells rushed back to Jonathan. The man who predicted it all was standing in front of Jonathan. His clothes were all tattered and torn. What used to be a white business shirt was stained grimy yellow, like it had been soaked in sweat and urine. All the buttons were torn off. The only remnants were a few white cotton threads that hung limply in place. The man wore a surprisingly clean black vest over the shirt, but it had faded over time. There were several small tears along the edges of the vest. His pants were a light brown, and black stains were all over them. Jonathan didn't want to know what had caused them, and shuddered at the very thought of it. His bare feet were stained brown from many years of walking without any shoes. His long, dark brown hair was stringy and knotted. It had not been cut in several years, and his face was hidden behind a scraggly beard. Clumps of dirt dangled from the curly strands. Mud and dirt smeared his face. There was not a clear patch of skin anywhere. Dark green eyes, with flecks of hazel, greeted Jonathan from behind his hair. A tint of madness sparkled there. Or was it sanity? Jonathan wondered. A dirty and grimy hand reached out before Jonathan could react. His fingers ensnared Jonathan's collar. It felt as deadly as a viper. Fear paralyzed Jonathan. He stood still, as if he was a statue. Uncertain of the homeless man's intentions, a million thoughts screamed in Jonathan's mind. Was he going to rob me, hurt me, or worse? The possibilities were endless, and each sent a shiver down Jonathan's already numb spine. His eyes hardened for a moment, and with clarity he slowly looked Jonathan over. He was studying him ever so carefully. Finally, the homeless man spoke. Today is the end. It is the final day of mankind. His voice was almost sweet as he spoke. Fear washed over Jonathan. It hit him like a never-ending wave, crashing against him so hard that Jonathan almost doubled over in pain. It was like this homeless man had punched Jonathan in the stomach with his words. It drove the air out of his lungs with each syllable. Somehow, Jonathan knew this man was right. You are the only one who can save us. You have to change, and change now. Life is a stage, my boy, and we are all in its casts. We are all fools and puppets. Now go and find the truth before it's too late. His voice was barely a whisper as his hand suddenly dropped. The light faded from his eyes and his lifeless stare was locked onto Jonathan. For the first time in his life, Jonathan was terrified about what was coming. Usually, he just limped from place to place, somehow getting by, never committing to anything. It was just easier that way. At that moment, Jonathan did the one thing that he'd been doing all his life. He turned and started to run. He didn't know where or what he was running from. How could he stop what was coming? He didn't have the answers. I don't know, his mind cried out. Eventually, he couldn't run anymore, and his legs failed him. He knew he couldn't outrun it anymore. He didn't even pay attention to where he was going. Looking around, Jonathan realised he was in a tube station. Pale green tiles covered every inch of the floor, walls and roof. A sickly yellow fluorescent light blinked on and off as Jonathan stood there. The humming of the light made Jonathan feel ill. The mere thought of the homeless man and his words made it worse. It had suddenly become too much for Jonathan, and he closed his eyes and started to cry. Salty tears stained his exhausted body, crept down his cheeks and soaked his dry, cracked lips. The taste caused Jonathan to open his eyes. It was then Jonathan began to whisper over and over again a new mantra. Please don't ask me. I don't know. Jonathan didn't know how long he'd be walking, but eventually he ended up back at his apartment. He'd lived there for years since coming to London. He sat down on his well-worn bed. The rusty springs would always poke him painfully whenever he sat down on it. Jonathan decided it'd be safer to hide away from the world than face the man's words. The spring dug painfully into Jonathan. He just kept repeating his new prayer. Please, don't ask me. I don't know. The next day, the sun greeted Jonathan's weary eyes, and he struggled to focus on his apartment. All the usual noise that would typically disturb Jonathan's morning was absent. Not even the sound of that annoying songbird next door. It would whistle and sing, much to Jonathan's disgust. Hopefully, it was dead, Jonathan thought as he got out of bed. Approaching the window, he leaned against it. The street below was deathly silent. No one. He saw no one. The old man's words came rushing back to him. Today is the end. It is the final day of mankind. His words hung in the air. He was now a mad prophet of the past. Jonathan realised as a bitter thought encroached on his new silent world. He was lost and had been left behind. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's Lullaby. These series of stories are based off Ozzy Osbourne's first album, Blizzard of Ozz, and I thought that I would reimagine his stories in a more darker, horrific context. So if you enjoy this content, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And remember, dear viewer, keep watching for what's in the dark.